And it's being forgotten right now with what I'm going to call it, necessary focus, but ultimately obsession about CO2 being all that matters. People are forgetting that you have to start with energy. It has to be abundant and affordable and available for all. And once you address that, then we can start talking about what are the environmental and emissions attributes and so forth that we clearly do need to focus on. But people need energy. There is not life without energy. And I don't know why people forget it, but we do have to seemingly be reminded every so often about this.
Just because the facts are A, if the narrative is B and everyone believes the narrative, then B is what matters. But it's our job in our industry to speak up proudly, soberly, and to engage people in this dialogue. Those 2.5 billion people that are in energy poverty, they need us.
America cannot meet this threat alone.
If there is a single country,
of course, the world cannot meet it without America,
that is willing to
but we're going to need you, the next generation, to finish the
overhaul
job.
nuclear regulation,
We need scientists to design new
and
fuels.
focus on net public
We
benefit
need engineers to invent new technologies. We
over absurd levels of radiation
need
protection,
entrepreneurs to sell those technologies.
then we will march towards this.
We need workers to operate assembly lines that hum with high-tech, zero-carbon
We have
components.
unlimited prosperity for all humans.
We need diplomats and businessmen and women and Peace Corps volunteers to help developing nations skip past the dirty phase of development and transition to sustainable sources of energy. In other words, we need you.
Welcome to another episode of the Fire to Fission podcast, where we talk about energy-dense fuels and how they can better human lives. My name's Mark Hinaman, and I'm joined today by Arjun Murti, partner at Veriton. Arjun, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me, Mark. Nice to see you here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to get to chat with you today. I feel like I know more about you than you'll ever know about me, because you put out a lot of great content through Close the Business Tuesday and Super Spiked and your own podcast. And so, but I'm always impressed with kind of your intelligence level and your view on the world. So I'm excited to get to chat with you.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much for inviting me. As I mentioned, I'm excited that you are an apparent CU Buffs fan. So I went to college in Denver, and they were our adopted college team, and excited to be here with you. So thank you.
For those just listening, I'm wearing a CU Buff sweatshirt. So yeah. All right. So Arjun, we typically like to start by giving some background on the guest. So why don't you give kind of a brief 30-second overview of what you do at Veriton?
Sure. So Veriton's a firm that is helping energy companies, large and small. It is global, though, with a huge North American focus, to help them think through the energy outlook. And that includes macro. It includes things like transition. How do companies think about what role they have going forward? It is to stick with oil and gas if that's their background. Is it to try new energies and all that kind of stuff? What is the outlook for growth, for returns, and all these kind of things? My own background is as an equity research analyst, is still how I identify. So been doing this for about 30 years, all focused on energy. Bulk of my career was at Goldman Sachs, and people can see all this stuff on LinkedIn, but kind of first 20 years as sort of a public Wall Street equity research analyst. The last decade, I've been on various boards and advisory roles. And then our mutual friend Maynard Holt convinced me that unretiring, as I say, I retired from Goldman in 2014, unretiring to join Veriton as a partner earlier in 2023. It's been a great decision. Kids are leaving for college, and we've got this crazy new energy cycle upon us. And I try and bring that perspective of sort of a lifelong career energy equity research analyst to thinking about the sector and the world going forward.
Tracking equities in the public market over the past 20 years. Well, I guess you said 20 years, so 2014.
30, yeah.
30, so you gave it away.
Yeah, the
right?
first
30.
20 at Goldman and then the last 10 in these board and advisory roles. So yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, you saw it through what, 90s, 2000s, and then 2010s, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Give us some perspective on maybe some of the most exciting and some of the most depressing times through the 90s and 2000s. I mean, I know you're not maybe prepared for that, but the kind of what comes to mind is it was kind of a sleepy time in the industry, right? There was oil price was kind of just hovering in what I would say kind of a bottom relative to now.
I mean, it's funny. I've been in both a lackluster period, a super cycle, the bust from the super cycle, and now whatever this recovery is being called, messy energy transition is the word I use. And it's been exciting throughout. So I'm by chance in the energy sector. My first job happened to be at a boutique oil and gas investment bank is how I got into the sector. But I started when Henry Hub gas had just fallen below $1, and it was a big deal that it was below $1. And then 1994 oil collapsed because Metallgesellschaft, a trading firm, had some issues, and oil, I can't remember the exact price it fell to, but it was like $12 or $13 from what had been kind of a $15 to $20 per barrel oil environment. We had the Asian financial crisis in 98. We had the tragedy of 9/11, which I worked downtown at the time. We had the tech bubble burst and boom. We've had the great financial crisis, oil going from 20 to 100 to ultimately 147, and myself and my team, and we're kind of a big part of sort of making some good and some bad calls in that period. And then the post-bust 24, like, it has been a global sector. It's been volatile, and whether it's been in favor or out of favor, it's actually always been important. I used to say that, like, even in 1999, at the height of the tech bubble burst, Exxon was always a top 3 S&P stock. That has been true until the last 5 years. And people always care about the price of oil. No one debates polypropylene prices. No one debates the price of Coca-Cola or Starbucks coffees, but everyone has a view on oil prices. It impacts presidential elections. President Biden clearly felt pressure when gasoline prices rose above $5 a gallon, 2 summers ago or whenever it was. And it's not just Biden. It is all presidents always care about the gasoline price. And so I've been very lucky to be involved in this sort of great global and important sector, irrespective of whether the sector itself from a public equity standpoint has been in or out of favor. I consider myself very lucky. I'm an accidental energy equity analyst, that is for sure.
Yeah. You're exactly right. It influences everything we do. That's why it's so exciting. Sometimes it can feel boring because it's like, it's every day. There's always the oil price, and it always comes back. But yeah,
it's so fundamental to life, right? And sorry to interrupt. People take it for granted. So the cycles are long. We say 15 years up, 15 years down for, let's just call it traditional oil and gas. And I think for some newer stuff like residential solar, these cycles are seemingly much shorter and so forth. But oil is long-term in nature. It is 80% of our primary energy comes from oil, gas, and coal. So it is just fundamental to everything else in life. This, a Zoom recording, the clothes we're wearing, clearly powering the lights that are on in our respective studios, driving our cars, but it is everything. It is not just gasoline and power gen. It is a building block for everything. And I think that is often forgotten. And it's being forgotten right now with what I'm going to call it, necessary focus, but ultimately obsession about CO2 being all that matters. People are forgetting that you have to start with energy. It has to be abundant and affordable and available for all. And once you address that, then we can start talking about what are the environmental and emissions attributes and so forth that we clearly do need to focus on. But people need energy. There is not life without energy. And I don't know why people forget it, but we do have to seemingly be reminded every so often about this.
It's easy to forget because it's so easily available, right? I mean, we haven't had shortages of gasoline in the United States or really globally since like the 80s, right? I mean, you never run out of energy, but when the power goes out, people notice, right? So
people, it is, it's funny. It is in some respects available and abundant. It is a miracle of industry, of economic systems. Some energy is produced by privately owned or publicly traded companies that are in capitalist systems, but some comes from state-owned companies, which are anything but capitalist in orientation, states like Saudi Arabia and Russia and some of these places and so forth. But whatever it is, it is a really hard thing to do. And I think those of us in Wall Street don't have sufficient appreciation for the challenges of actually getting energy out of the ground, converting it into a useful product, let alone the broader public. And again, I think it feeds into the unfortunate dialogue that's happening around energy transition. Well, this stuff's just easy. You snap your finger and boy, we can get gasoline easy. And yeah, I remember in the 70s, there was some price controls and some embargoes that caused gasoline. I was alive for that. I remember waiting in gas lines with my mom, odd and even license plates and these kind of things. But people take this stuff for granted and they think it's easy. And I think we shouldn't confuse the fact that it's been a very successful industry in the sense that we have had miraculous economic growth. We have the least number of people in poverty globally. We have had massive population growth, all driven by energy, but it's not easy. And therefore, transition is not going to be easy. And I know that'll be something we'll talk about. So,
Well, your perspective is a good one, I think, and it brings to mind the age of the industry. Oil and gas isn't a young industry relative to, say, the carbon capture industry or a carbon credit market. I mean, we've been doing this since the 1800s, and globally, it's over 100, 150 years old, right? So, if you looked at it from that lens, then the new energies that we'll talk about, it is very young and has room to grow. So.
I think that's right. And so the idea that by some random round number year, and you can call it 2050 or 2040 or even 2060, that we will have shifted out of something that's taken 150 years to build up. And again, with it, created significant population, economic, and lifestyle improvements, poverty reduction, all these kind of things, and that this can somehow just totally be transformed over the next 30 years in the existing places that are lucky to have abundant energy. And I'm talking the lucky 1 billion of us in the US, Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, versus the other 7 billion people on Earth. And we'll get to this, I know, that are using a fraction of the energy that we do, that you're going to transform all of this into new stuff that is largely untested at scale. That is what I push back hard on. It's not that we shouldn't care or want to do new energies. I think the world will absolutely want to, because it is not going to want to just be dependent on Saudi, Iraq, Iran, Russia, or for that matter, depend on the country, the United States or Canada. Whatever one thinks about any country, as a foreign nation, you're going to want to try and control your own destiny, and that is the motivation of doing new energies. But the idea that we can just scale all this stuff up and satisfy all the world's current needs and future needs by 2050 or 2060, it's absurd. This whole thing will take 100 to 150 years. That is the kind of time frames. It doesn't mean we shouldn't think about being urgent, but it is 100-year transformation. It is not a 10 or 20 or 30-year transformation.
Which, if it's going to take that long, we got to start now. So,
for sure, absolutely. There's nothing about what I'm saying that says anything should be delayed. I should be clear about that. It is about being pragmatic and realistic about how big of a challenge we are facing. And I know we'll get to nuclear, but the fact that it's only just now starting to gain some acceptance as a possible, like if we want to decarbonize, it's going to have to be a big part of the solution. And I think it's a great case in point that let's not wait 10 years to then recognize we need to do nuclear. That's an example of something we should be aggressively going after today, still keeping in mind it's going to take 50 or 100 years to get nuclear to where I think it needs to be, and that is a major part of the energy mix.
I couldn't agree more. So Arjun, tell us briefly about Veriton. I mean, you mentioned kind of a 30-second overview of what you guys did, but what's your role within the organization? I mentioned Close the Business Tuesday, right? That's a podcast that you guys run on Tuesday afternoons and then release on Wednesday mornings. And then Super Spiked is kind of your own brand. Give us some perspective on kind of the organization and what you guys are trying to accomplish.
So there's 5 partners, and I want to say 15, soon to be 16 employees in total. And the 5 of us have generally known each other for some version of 20 or 30 years. So Maynard Holt, our founder.
That was going to be my question. How did Maynard loop you back in to come out of retirement?
Maynard and I worked together 20 years ago at Goldman Sachs. And I do remember going to lunch with Maynard. It was probably 2001, 2002, an analyst. He was a banker. I was an analyst. We could talk to each other in those days. And his dream was that him and I and a third person, Mark Meyer, could do a radio show, because there's no such thing as podcasting or Zoom or those kind of things. We could just talk about energy issues and educate people. And he's always had that dream. And he left Goldman, founded Tudor, Pickering, Holt, one of the leading boutique oil and gas investment banks. And when him and Bobby sold it to Perella Weinberg, and he said, I'm going to start something new. I want to start a company that is not an investment bank, but that helps companies. I want to start a company that is involved with research and education, but doesn't do traditional sell-side research. Same thing for capital markets and all these other areas. So we're a non-investment bank that wants to help companies think through what does energy transition mean, to help them strategically, analytically work through whether it's transactions or analyses or what have you. And we do that based on our background. So we don't view ourselves as a competitor for investment banks. They're going to help companies actually close and complete transactions. What we'd like to do is help companies say, is this good or bad? We're not going to get paid a fee on whether you successfully do the transaction, which is how most investment banking works. We're not going to do research that's targeted at the buy-side investors to try and make buy, hold, or sell decisions. We'd like to do macro-oriented research that, again, speaks to where is this industry growing over the next 10 to 20 to 30 years. to help boards and executive leadership teams think through things. Both Close the Business Tuesday, which is a weekly video podcast, and my Super Spiked, which I publish on Saturdays, which is usually written but has an occasional podcast or video every third or fourth week. It is meant to be in part energy education for the masses. So both are broadly available to anybody. They're both for free. And we notice there's a lot of energy illiteracy out there. And whatever small role we can help play in educating the world is the real point of that. It obviously has some networking and those kind of benefits as well. But it is meant to be energy literacy and energy education, and just sort of here's what we think of the world. And those are the 2 4 free things we produce. And I'm sorry, there's a third thing we do. So we produce some of this research content. We try and help companies strategically think about where they want to go. We also have an energy transition fund called Next10, NEXTEN. It's $85 million capital we raised. And that is focused on really new energies exclusively. We like and invest and support oil and gas, but for this fund specifically, it is focused just on the new opportunities.
Yeah. No, that's excellent background, because looking from the outside, it's not always obvious. And I love that. I mean, you guys aren't, I won't say old guys, but seasoned professionals that have kind of leaned into
We're
this.
definitely all old. We have one younger person, but we're definitely on the older side of things. So I'm noticing that we're older than some of the management teams now. And it's a weird thing when suddenly like, wow, that CEO is actually like 47 or something like that, which to me now seems like super young. So
yeah. But you're leaning in, we're podcasting, we're making the company that we want. We've got this vision. It's cool. I like it.
But we have a former president who became president through Twitter. So I think social media should be part of everyone's playbook. So if you can go from not being a politician, I'm not trying to make this controversial, but it's factual. He went from not being a politician to being president, in part from Celebrity Apprentice and in part from Twitter. There's something to be said for figuring out new ways to be visible. I think that we can take away, whatever one's view is of any of our politicians. We can take that away from it.
So what is Super Spiked? You mentioned it's industry research, and you publish an article. I always love it, but what do you try and accomplish with this newsletter?
For 10 years, I've had these various and involved with Columbia's Center on Global Energy Policy, all as an advisory board member. And the point there is all of these are sort of behind the scenes kind of roles. And I have learned a lot and really loved all those engagements. And all 3 of those, by the way, are still active. I'm still continuing with all 3 of those while having joined Veriton. But what they don't do is provide sort of some public outlet, and you're certainly behind the scenes and sort of giving advice or governance as you will. And as we went through sort of 2018, 2019, the ESG movement rose. Suddenly everyone became, quote, Paris aligned on their objectives, and we then started moving into this world of sort of energy transition has to happen by 2050. I feel like there's been a lot of noise, a lot of misunderstanding. I'm going to call it misinformation from folks who think we can do this quickly and that we have all the technologies and that it's just a question of will and we just need to really believe and really double down. If we could just stop those awful oil company lobbyists or some of the climate deniers, it'd just be golden out there. And there's large aspects of that. So it's one thing to say, okay, there's some mistakes that oil companies have made over the years. Some of them had poor profitability. Maybe there were statements made about the effect of carbon emissions and so forth that, one could question the validity of those statements, looking back now 20 years from now. There's plenty of misinformation that comes from those most passionate about the climate as well. And my point is not to be pro or con anything, actually. It is to take that equity analyst perspective and say, what do I think is actually going to happen? What is the path forward? How do I make the right call on how much oil and gas we're going to use? What is the scope of ramping up solar or wind or battery storage or electric vehicles? And how will that interplay with broad economic growth and lifting 7 billion people further out of poverty? And there's a long way to go on that metric. And how does that all add up without being an ideologue about it? And that is why I created Super Spiked. It was in reaction to what I viewed as we're on track for a really messy energy transition. Where energy transition, certainly in 2020 and 2021, seemed to mean we're going to yell at a bunch of oil companies, we're going to protest oil and gas projects, but mind you, only in the United States, Canada, and Europe for some reason. We're not going to go to Saudi Arabia, we're not going to go to Iran, we're not going to go to Russia and tell them to keep it in the ground. We're only going to protest and put pressure on Western oil and gas companies. And that somehow, by putting that pressure, will result in less supply, and that will lead to less demand. And then they will be out of the way, and we can ramp up solar and wind, and just, such a piece of cake, right? And there was no part of that I thought made any sense. You can yell at oil and gas companies all you want. As an equity analyst, we definitely don't love all oil and gas companies, right? Plenty of companies that give you a real bunch of heartache, and you think, man, they are making some bad investments, or they're too optimistic, or they missed their targets. Like, Wall Street analysts are totally capable of completely disliking large segments of the oil and gas industry for reasons of, hey, they were bad stocks and they misled us on some production target or what have you. So it's not about loving or hating the industry, but it is about recognizing we absolutely need oil and gas supply. So no one has to love oil executives. I happen to like many of them, and there's some that I don't like, as you'd expect throughout society. And it's true for any sector: tech, pharma, doctors, nurses, not every, all aspects of life. The idea that energy transition means shutting in supply in Western countries is really the part that I think is most problematic at its core. It is not going to lead to less demand. It is going to lead to greater political power in places like Saudi, Iraq, Russia. We can see that. We can see that in the last 2 or 3 years. It's going to lead to high and volatile prices, and we're not going to be affecting our CO2 trajectory even one iota. So for those, again, who are most passionate about dealing with carbon emissions, I didn't think there was any part of their strategy that was going to help what they purport to care most about, which is addressing carbon emissions. And so all of that was the motivation to write Super Spiked. And my point was simply that, hey, I think I do know something about energy. Doesn't mean I'm right, but let me at least share my perspectives. And no matter how I'm coming across now, I really hate partisanship on both sides. I don't like the hard left that we need to yell at oil companies and keep it in the ground, but I don't like the hard right either, where the view seems to be solar and wind are dumb, the climate's always changing, so let's just skip it all. And you can have that view. What I would say is that if you're China and you're currently importing 12 million barrels a day of oil, and you don't have robust oil supply to match your demand growth, and you're only at 4 barrels per capita of oil consumption, the US is at 20. So yes, you're richer than you once were, but you're definitely not a rich country yet. You're somewhere in that middle income level. You're going to be highly motivated to try and figure out ways to not consume as much oil going forward because you don't have it. And so there's a huge case to be made for new energy. I would say China would rather have a coal-fired EV over an OPEC plus or shale-fired ICE vehicle. And I think India is going to be the same. I think the rest of Southeast Asia, meaning they're going to be highly motivated to try and do stuff that does not require energy imports. You don't want to be dependent on oil, and you don't want to be dependent on natural gas or LNG if you don't have it. Doesn't mean you're not going to be using more of this stuff. I don't think there's any decade, let alone year, where we can today point to, well, that's when it definitely peaks. We don't know, because the energy needs of the rest of the world is so massive, and we don't know what else is going to scale up and help meet those needs. So I think oil and gas will be a part of the solution. There's a huge motivation to do new energy. So there's no reason. And by the way, we do have environmental challenges that, frankly, Republicans on the right in the US could do a much better job of proactively addressing. And there's lots of benefits, in my opinion, for dealing with carbon emissions, certainly dealing with methane, which is a cell. Why wouldn't we want to capture it and try and both reduce our emissions, but also provide a product that can be sold to those in need of energy? And so both sides have issues. There's a need for pragmatism. The last thing that should be partisan is energy. It doesn't make sense that oil and gas is Republican and solar and wind are Democrat. How does that make sense? I think the role of markets versus the role of government policy, that to me should be the appropriate level of debate for energy. Do we need a lot of heavy-handed public policy, which is something Democrats might favor, or do we find innovation and free market solutions that Republicans may favor? And of course, with energy, we're going to need a mix of the two, because you will not solve all your energy needs only with free markets or only with government policy. But why isn't that the source of debate? Why is it the energy source, oil and gas versus renewables, that somehow is our partisan divide? It doesn't make sense. And all of this is a long-winded way of saying it's what motivated me to start creating Super Spiked.
I love it. I mean, that's just a ton of information and different topics that you think it sounds like a simple subject, and it never is. You talk a lot about in Super Spiked ROCE, or return on capital. It's fun when I talk to finance guys. In physics, there's so many. It feels like there's a singular truth, right? Many problems are deterministic, and as an engineer background, it's like, oh yeah, well that's just how something exists, right? But then we have these units, and you do unit conversions all the time. I think of many financial metrics as unit conversions, but so some of them there's nuance to all of them. So it's kind of a simple question for finance guy, but give us kind of an overview on this metric, return on capital employed.
I actually think you set it up very well. It's interesting to talk to someone with sort of an engineering and science background, because that notion of a singular truth is actually, it really resonates, where when it comes to profitability, there is definitely not a singular truth. So return on capital employed is a metric. It's one of many. You can't always talk about 9 metrics. The idea is to provide a metric that represents total company profitability. So other metrics that have been talked about is, I'm going to drill a shale well. Here's the internal rate of return on this singular well. And the issue that has occurred for this industry over the last decade is the project returns, in this case, a shale well, it could be an LNG project, oil sands facility, whatever.
They look really good.
They look good. And so the issue was like, these companies said in the 2015 to 20 period, at $50 oil, drilling shale wells in the Permian, Eagle Ford, and Bakken, we are going to generate 30 to 50% IRRs, internal rates of return, 30 to 50%. And I feel like for a non-finance person, that sounds like a great number. I mean, if interest rates were 0 and like 8 or 9% sounds like kind of a stable return, 30%, that's a really high return. And, their total company profitability over 2015 to 2020 was either 0%, -1%, or -4%, depending on exactly which year you're including or excluding. And are you including 20 companies or 22 companies or 18 companies? But it was basically 30 to 50%.
Meaning they didn't actually make money.
Exactly.
Period. Even though they had this metric of IRR.
Yep, there were taxes, acreage costs. The wells are more heterogeneous than the simple IRR math would lead you to believe. In some cases, you drill the well, but you didn't complete the well. And, what's the return on that? It's negative 100% while you're waiting for the stupid well to come online. And if it took 3 years for the duck, as they were called, the drilled but uncompleted well to come online, and over the period, you'd spent a bunch of money on your well costs. And so, it was ridiculous. It wasn't like in the old days when you did Gulf of Mexico or oil sands, because the project costs included most of the costs at the time. If you're doing an oil sands facility, you've got an upgrader, you've got to steam the wells, you probably have to have some sort of sense of a refining thing. There was a whole bunch of costs that got included because shale incurred in the US, where the industry is fragmented. So you've got an upstream company, you've got a drilling company, you've got a midstream company, you've got a processing, it is so disaggregated because it is mature. That is, on the one hand, a good thing. On the other hand, it led these E&Ps to overstate what their profitability was. And so, it is a metric. There are other metrics one could use. There are pros and cons to the technical return on capital employed calculation. But I do think some notion of a total corporate level profitability is important. And you can still talk about project returns. And I think companies understandably do that. But they do have to tie it back to what the total enterprise is making. And that was really lacking, really, frankly, for most of my career, but certainly in the last decade. And I think industry is doing better on getting closer on these things now. So,
gotcha. For some projects in different energy space or different energy generation technologies, the returns haven't been as good as oil and gas. Notwithstanding 2015, 2020, returns were not good on a company-wide level. But I think the renewable sector comes to mind, right? The wind and solar piece, and having 4 to 6% rates of return on those projects, and being long projects. It's always been difficult for me conceptually to understand how you would build a successful company and expand at kind of that small growth rate.
There's no simple answer to your comment. And so,
I don't know that there's
let's stick with actually, let's do offshore wind, since that's an obvious case in point. So they were targeting at the peak of the cycle, which was now 2021, 2022. I'm talking about offshore wind in the United States. We're going to secure a 5% rate of return. That sounds like a low number. I don't think you can say 5% in and of itself is low or high. What the problem was, it turned out to be low, not because 5% was necessarily low, but because the CapEx and the underlying costs were not hedged. And so suddenly, if you could guarantee the 5% and you have a 30-year kind of fixed return on your power with some escalator, and you levered it up, you could actually make the case that, well, the levered returns 12% or something like that. It's hard to simplify any of these things. And again, I think there was a lot of bad investments made, especially in offshore wind. You can see the write-offs. I'm not defending the 5%. What I would argue, though, is I think all these profitability statements or analyses, they're far more complex than the simple, well, solar's 4% and oil and gas is now 15. Oil and gas is more volatile. I think oil and gas overall has generated a cost to capital return, actually, as one would expect in commodity business. But there's a subset of companies that have generated mid-teens or better returns on capital over very long periods of time that they're now getting back towards, that are sort of in the very good bucket. But they're frankly many bad companies who are third and fourth quartile companies who, frankly, I'd rather have a solar return at 6% with the right solar company that has correctly hedged their capex and costs and so forth. I mean, so it's hard to stereotype. It is all worthy of discussion. And of course, people always make whatever point they want to make. So like, hey, if the last decade was poor for oil and gas and you want to disincentivize oil and gas investment, you say, well, look, they didn't even make good returns. So you should all be doing solar, which the 7% in solar kind of equates to some long-term average of 7% for oil and gas. And there's a lot of politicization of these returns. And I think that is, if financial analysts have any role in the world, is to help sort through profitability. And I don't think, no energy source, no region is absolute high or low. Like take the Permian Basin. There are good parts and there are bad parts. There are good companies and there are bad companies developing the wells. You just can't say all of the Permian is low cost and high return. Some is, some isn't. That's going to be true for solar. It's going to be true for wind. It's going to be true for basically just about everything. It is going to depend on exactly the nature of the resource on the project, who's doing it, what they've hedged or not hedged, how good they are at executing. There are just so many variables. What I would say, though, is for new energies, we don't know which are going to stand the test of time, excluding government subsidies or those kind of things. And I think that's where the issue becomes one to energy transition. So if like hydrogen requires a massive subsidy just to get a project off the ground, you're going to have to believe from a macro standpoint that hydrogen can scale without subsidy. And I would differentiate that from maybe an individual company generating good returns on a subsidized project. And that to me is what a lot of solar is and wind is, where if they've had subsidies, there's nothing wrong with the companies who are then sort of, essentially taking advantage of those, not only taking advantage in a bad way, but using those subsidies to justify their business models. It's a complex issue. When I look at it from a macro perspective, I think we don't know what is going to compete with oil and gas, quite frankly. There are some things out there that show some promise, but man, it is still a long way to go.
I like how you provide the color that there's nuance to it, and there can be successful companies in an unsuccessful industry.
For sure, and vice versa, right? There are plenty of bad oil companies during the super cycle, as an example, 20 years ago.
Lots of bankruptcies, right? Bankruptcy lawyers built their careers in oil and gas in the 2010s, right?
The trickiest thing on energy transition is if you're a country like China or India, you may choose to subsidize things because you'd rather subsidize solar and wind or electric vehicles in your country than import oil or natural gas. And so there is a tendency for oil and gas people to kind of say, well, all that stuff requires subsidies. And yeah, once the subsidies run out, governments can't afford it. They're going to do something different, but it's expensive to fight wars. It's expensive to, oil and gas prices can be as high as $150 to $200 a barrel. They're not always $50 a barrel. There are periods of time where for 10 or 15 years, oil is going up and to the right, as we saw in the 70s, as an example. The price of oil went up 10x in that era. So it can be very expensive to be dependent on traditional oil and gas. I think there will be a motivation for governments to subsidize, if you will, some of this stuff. There's still a question of it's going to have to scale up to some degree on its own. And that's what I push back with on the people who say we can transition quickly. I don't think we know the degree to which we can scale up without being 100% dependent on subsidies. So,
yeah. We mentioned solar, wind, oil and gas, but what about geothermal or nuclear and their level of profitability and success moving forward?
The most important area is the nuclear area. And that is something that's really hard to understand why, for those people who care most about climate and think that is an existential issue and all urgent climate crisis kind of stuff, why isn't nuclear discussed? I mean, I understand, I basically grew up in the 70s and 80s. So I understand And we used to do these nuclear fallout drills out of fear that the Soviet Union was going to attack us in the 70s, which seemed ridiculous. I remember always thinking, well, how is hiding underneath this desk or next to this brick wall going to save me from a nuclear explosion? Those drills never made sense to me, other than if it was just to sort of scare us, or maybe it was propaganda. I don't know what it was, but I remember the fallout shelter was next to this brick wall. It just seemed like the worst place you'd want to be if the Soviet Union attacked us. But I'm getting off topic. My point was simply it is that history of nuclear war and the fear of nuclear war that I am sure is why people are against nuclear power. But if we're going to need it, we're going to need it for baseload. We're going to need it for if people really want truly zero emission stuff. It's not clearly, if you have a disaster, it can be awful. On the other hand, my understanding, you're probably more of a nuclear expert than me, is actually its safety track record is actually better than every other energy source. I don't think it's a close call, right?
It's really, really good.
It's
and
the
I
fear,
think it's
right?
a consequence of the underlying technology and not the regulations. But
I'm sure. I'm going to guess that since we last built nuclear in the 1970s, technology has probably progressed, and maybe we can do these things better. You know, I'm not.
2023, man. The latest plant
Something
came
should have
online in
improved
the
every
US.
10 years, I think, right? So my sense is that the worm is turning in a favorable direction on nuclear. It seems like even the COP28, nuclear was part of the discussion. There'll always be opponents, for or against all this stuff, but it does seem like there is some growing recognition that you have to start now. So again, even if I think this can take 100 years, certainly for nuclear, we have to start now. What I wonder about nuclear in the United States is we have this individual utility monopoly regulated market approach. And do we want individual utilities doing individual utility projects? I think that's worked for a lot of our history. I don't know if it works for nuclear. I do have, I don't know if admiration is the right word, but I have respect for what the United Arab Emirates is doing. I have respect for what China's done on the nuclear side. Nuclear experts can weigh in on whether they have the highest safety standards or not, or all the pros and cons of those industries. But my point would be, if there's a role for government, as someone who's kind of a Wall Street capitalist kind of guy, it is almost certainly with nuclear. I'm not the one to figure out what exactly that model is. I don't think it would ever be China or UAE. There's something about the regulated utility model of developing nuclear that feels like that's not going to optimize costs or speed of build out either. And I don't know what that private public partnership, if that's a buzzword.
Could there be perhaps a parallel to the shale revolution that could be copied by the nuclear industry?
I'm not sure, because shale was driven by smaller companies, of which there was a large number of existing companies. Like if ExxonMobil had owned, I don't mean to pick on Exxon, it's one of my favorite companies actually, but if they had owned all of the US shale industry, we would have, I swear, zero US shale production. And that is why other countries like China, Argentina's not a perfect example because Vaca Muerta is ramping up a little bit, but what we have is property rights, tax law, rule of law. We have a capitalist system. We have a lot of things that are great about America that no other country really has. Canada would come the closest. They're trying their hardest to, not be a good capitalist country for whatever reason. But now I'm going to not be. I love Canada, by the way, too. And I'm not a, anyway, I love Canada. And there's some things at the federal level that I might push back on. Maybe that's the correct way to say all this. We're the two places, right? And so I don't think that that's the best. I don't personally think, I'm not a nuclear expert, but I don't think it's the best analogy for shale, for nuclear shale. But something is. I'm not sure what it is. So you have to about geothermal as well. That's an area I find intriguing. I understand it can be baseload, power generation, can be storage. I've spoken actually at a geothermal conference a year ago. They were looking for a profitability discussion on oil and gas and how, that to me seems to be the other area that we could stand to spend a lot more time on. Nuclear is obvious. Geothermal probably requires study, but if we're going to study wind and solar and this other stuff, it seems like we could stand to study geothermal. And I think all these things have their niche and by niche I mean it could be a large number, but their area where they're going to do best at. Like there certainly are regions where solar makes a ton of sense, and there are definitely regions where solar does not make sense. And same thing with wind. And I'm going to assume the same thing for geothermal. Where it makes sense, we should try and use it.
Gotcha. So we're recording this December 20th, 2023. So, and I think we'll probably post this pretty soon. So, but you just came out with the lessons from 2023 that I thought was excellent. And I had some follow-up questions, so
Sure.
you don't need to regurgitate all of it, meaning folks can go and find it on their own. But you talked about uh, kind of ROC pullback, new energies, the TAM, total addressable market for energy, which I thought were all wonderful topics. You'd mentioned offshore wind uh, pulling back or pulling back. Can you expand a little bit on what wasn't hedged and why some of these companies had to write off or make big write-offs this year?
Yeah, I mean, so like it was a year where energy broadly struggled. Energy got to as high as 5% of the S&P 500. This is probably a metric of investor interest, and it's now about 4%. So this is the broad energy sector that's going to skew towards traditional energy, oil and gas, to be specific about it.
Which
The
is
new
quite
energy,
low, right? Historically, energy has been 5 to 10%, right?
it's historically been, I would say,
S&P.
8 to 12% of the S&P. It got as low as 2% during COVID, and so it's up to 4, but that's off of a peak of 5. I hate using the term clean energy, but it's what the index is called, the ICLN Clean Energy Index. No energy source is clean or dirty, brown or green. They all have
Yeah,
different attributes of cost and emissions and
differing
other
levels
attributes
of environmental impacts.
for
It's
sure.
just
But
a
I will,
matter of
I'm gonna,
somewhere along the mission value chain.
for the purpose of speaking about an index, use its actual name, which is the ICLN Clean ETF. I use it as a proxy for a broad swath of solar, wind, biofuels, a whole bunch of new energies in there. Like it peaked with the Biden becoming his inauguration, and it fell in 2022 and it collapsed in 2023. I mean, that sector, those names were down 60, 70, 80%. I'm talking everything: residential solar, biofuels, all the new EV companies, excluding Tesla, a wide swath of new energy. And some people say, yeah, see, it's all dumb. And it's like, no, it got overhyped. Classic boom bust cycle. It's now crashed. And now we're going to sort through what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. I think the offshore wind was sort of the height of hubris, where we can lock in 5%. And yeah, interest rates are going to be 0% forever, and there'll never be inflation. And they got both of those key inputs wrong. So if you've now hedged your selling price for 30 years, locking in a 5% rate of return or even a 7% rate of return on what you thought was going to be the interest rate and cost environment, and both change dramatically. We go from 0% to 5% in short-term rates, and suddenly we have a whole bunch of capex inflation for steel and everything else. Well, then suddenly you're going to have to write off. I mean, some of them have completely written off their projects, which is bad as anything any oil and gas company has done when they've had write-offs. And so it's a capital intensive sector. So I don't know that offshore wind is necessarily going to make some massive comeback. I think residential solar is actually the most mature. It's been around for a few cycles. All these sectors have their pros and cons, and I think it'll be interesting to sort through what does make sense. And I think that's what we're looking for. I think with the traditional energy sector, the profitability is still really good, especially relative to the last decade. It was sequentially down because oil and gas prices pulled back. And so from a trading standpoint, I appreciate why short-term investors are going to sell off the sector. But I take a lot of comfort that now we've had 3 good years of really much improved profitability, capital spending still in check, and so forth. So I think the traditional energy sector, once people get over recession concerns, has a very bright future. I think for new energies, it's about sorting through the rubble and seeing which of these crazy things might make some sense.
You've talked a little bit about a company's unique value proposition and how some companies are engaged in kind of new energy technologies, like Oxy's got carbon capture projects, Devon's got a geothermal project, Chevron's even invested in a fusion company, TAE. But you also mentioned that there's probably a better role for pure play new energy companies to be solely focused on just those things. And because, I mean, some of these bigger companies aren't good at the innovation, just like you said. If it was up to Exxon, we wouldn't have a shale industry, right? If they were responsible. So, can you riff on that a little bit and why that's the case? I mean, you don't need to bring examples specifically from anyone that you're directly associated with, but why are some of these bigger companies, even though they're energy companies, not as good at being kind of the innovators in the new energy space?
There's actually two kind of somewhat not totally related points to this discussion. The first I want to address is this idea that you just asked about of should traditional energy, should they be forced or have to do? Is it their responsibility to do new energy? So you hear things like the IEA, all these sort of globalist organizations say oil and gas needs to get on board with the energy transition, and they need to allocate a significant portion of their capex going forward to new energy so we can solve the urgent climate crisis. And my point would simply be, what is the history of yesterday's companies being the leaders in tomorrow's technologies? Like, if Blockbuster had bought Netflix, which they were offered, I believe, $1 billion. It's in Reed Hastings' great book. It's got a red cover. I recommend it. Would we have streaming today? I mean, I guess we probably would, but would it be as like great? Like, and Blockbuster Video went away. Does anybody care? Did it impact anything? And so, if we remember when Walmart first came in and started taking away the old hardware stores and so forth, and that was going to be and suddenly then Amazon came away and took them. I mean, there's a history of innovation in this country, and especially in this country, the United States, where it is a new company that creates a new paradigm. I remember when Amazon was mocked for being an online. Barnes and Noble had the famous ad, "Who would want to buy books online?" And it's like it's laughable today. But who would want to go to a bookstore to buy books, right? So it is rarely, the one company that I say deserves some credit is probably under Satya Nadella and Microsoft, where they have really transformed to being, yesterday's software, Windows, whatever, Excel company to being a cloud infrastructure and all the great things they're doing. And it did not happen under Steve Ballmer. I'm not trying to pick on him, but it factually did not happen under him. It took someone different like Satya to lead. And so Microsoft may be one exception, but I defy people. I encourage people, tell me all the examples of yesterday's leader that became tomorrow's leader. Like, the iPhone killed Kodak or something like that. And I think there's this notion that if oil and gas companies don't, quote, get with the program, they're going to be left behind. Like, no way. The idea that there's going to be a fast energy transition, there is no chance of that. That is, you could say that's my opinion. I feel like I'm well on track for that opinion to be true. But even if it was true, let's just say we could have a fast transition. I think I'd much rather these traditional companies, not all of them, but some portion of them, liquidate. Like, return all your cash back to shareholders. Why do I think they're going to be leaders in something they know nothing about? The oil and gas companies had enough trouble being profitable in the business they've been doing for 100 years. How are they going to scale up something that they know nothing about? It makes absolutely no sense. That doesn't mean they shouldn't be trying anything. Exxon believes, Oxy believes that they can do carbon capture. We can have a separate conversation on the merits, the pros and cons, the ability to scale up CCUS and DAC, direct air capture, carbon capture, utilization, storage, and whether, what is the timing of this, what policies needed. Like, it's a separate conversation. They believe they can do that. Is the random mid-cap E&P going to be a leader in residential solar or geothermal or nuclear or anything? It's absurd to think that they are. And so if the business is going away, which I do not think it is any decade soon, maybe not even any century soon, if I'm wrong about that, they should sell their companies and or liquidate as a generic statement of what should happen. There's a separate topic where oil and companies have been so beat up that they're in this defensive mode of, oh, we're not going to waste your money, we're going to have good returns, and we're going to fix our balance sheet, and we have an ESG slide, and we have a Scope 1 emissions 0 slide. It's like, okay, saying you're not evil, this is not a positive equity story, right? These are table stakes. You got to have good returns, you got to have a good balance sheet, you got to have a plan for your Scope 1 emissions, you got to talk about your ESG stuff, and we can have a separate ESG conversation if we want, but whatever these things are, none of this is sort of, you're going to all have to do all this stuff. Why should people get excited about you? And I will say the new energies companies do a much better job of it. Hey, they may be ridiculous. They may be wrong. They may be too optimistic, all that kind of stuff. But at least they have a vision for who they want to be. And I think oil and gas companies are kind of like, hey, oil and gas isn't peaking this decade, but they all have it peaking next decade, by the way. Look at the forecast from Shell, BP, Exxon, all these big companies. They all have oil demand plateauing next decade. I'm saying I don't know how they know that, because I don't know how they know what's going to scale up. And I don't know why they're so pessimistic on the economic growth for the other 7 billion people on Earth. But some combination of that. So the oil and gas industry does not believe in its own future. And I get that it's been beat up and it needed to course correct to a degree, meaning, yeah, we vow not to waste your money. But 2024 ought to be the start of a year. What is your positive equity story? It could be returning cash to shareholders, but then that's your story. Or it could be exploration. Or it could be, we're going to explore and find some new shale basin. Or we're going to, pick up the pieces from everyone's cast-offs in the rest of the world. Or it could be LNG. Like, there's lots of things. It could be infrastructure. It could be refining is out of favor and we're going to gobble up some refineries. We're going to on the margin ensure that, this area is good. What is the story? It cannot be that our returns are good. We're not going to waste your money. And we got an ESG climate slide. That's not a story. And again, I will compliment the new energy sectors for doing a hell of a lot better job than most oil and gas companies on having a positive equity story.
That's awesome. Something that you highlight often is profitability and the importance of it, and that it's more important than growth. I think personally, the nuclear industry is missing this, and it's kind of missed, not intentionally, but because they're not building new projects. Right? We're not actually building a bunch of new nuclear power plants in the United States, so we don't know how to build profitable or do profitable projects. How do they fix that?
I don't know how they fix it. I will say that I think another example of a new company doing better than the old companies is Tesla in the EV market. And so again, we can separate the pros and cons of Elon. I think there are a lot of pros. There's some obvious personality things that we can say, why is he doing that or this or so forth? But there's no disputing they sell over 1 million vehicles, up from 0 10 years ago. And that is miraculous. And one can debate whether I think the market cap's like $700 million today, billion dollars, excuse me. I think it got briefly to $1 trillion. It's pulled back a little bit. It's still a massive, whatever it is, it's a massive number, well in excess of all the traditional OEMs. And so do we need a new model for nuclear or some new type of entrepreneur or visionary? Or is it that, this really isn't a private sector kind of thing? This is where we have kind of a regulated return kind of a model. But if you do that, how do you motivate these things to be sufficiently low cost and so forth? I think that's the tricky part. I'd say, to me, the point on profitability is it's a pro-capitalism argument. And I always take capitalism over any form of socialism. We do need rules and regulation. There's a role for government policy. But to me, no one should apologize for making profits. It is what allows the world to progress. It allows us to wear the clothes we're wearing.
Because profits allow us to reinvest in the community and go and do the project again, right? It's not like
it motivates investment. It motivates wealth creation, motivates entrepreneurship. It employs people. To me, is there no ills? Of course there are some ills, and those need to be corrected. Maybe that's why we have labor laws. Maybe that's why you're not allowed to dump chemicals into rivers. And we say, no, as a society, dumping chemicals into rivers is wrong. Yes, it'll raise your cost structure. Not dump it in a river. We're going to make you collect the chemicals and dispose of them somewhere else. That's going to cost a little more. As a society, where there can be certain things we're going to decide upon. But profits themselves are good. They've improved our living standards. They create new products and technologies. And the minor society ills that come from this, society can decide to address. Again, dumping chemicals in rivers is my example. Minimal labor standards, or even more than minimal labor standards, is another thing we should absolutely care about. Health, safety, and environment. It's a big part of most oil and gas companies, frankly, to their credit, more so than other industries. It's an area they excel on as an industry. I
agree.
Pro profits.
Well, Arjun, we're coming up on our time. I'd like to close on kind of your vision of the future, and specifically expanding on the total addressable market. And you mentioned 7 billion several times. Why is there so much space and opportunity for both traditional energy and new energy moving forward? And what does that look like in the next 10, 20 years?
If you look at economic development around the world, if you look at energy usage, if you look at any kind of sense of wealth, it is insane the degree to which there's about 1 billion of us that live in the United States, Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada and Japan that are disproportionately more wealthy than the other 7 and soon to be 9 billion people on Earth. This is not about whose fault that is or anything of that nature. Every country has its history. Every country has governments that people elect or don't elect because they're autocrats or what have you. There are a whole bunch of reasons. My point would simply be that the world, ultimately, we should all be similarly rich. That is a pro-capitalism, a pro-markets, a pro-wealth. Instead of us all being similarly miserable, which to me is socialism.
A pro-human view. Right?
It's a pro-human view, right? Everyone deserves an improving living standard. Every person deserves an education. It is pro-women's rights to have an advancing economy. It is pro-human rights to have an advancing economy. It's going to take energy. So I would say, without going on for 3 hours about this, the amount of energy that is required to get everyone to be similarly rich to the United States and Europe is as good and big of a secular growth opportunity as anything else out there. People think about AI and robotics and electric vehicles, a whole bunch of niche things. Ultimately, at its core is energy usage. And we are using, in some cases, 3 to 5 to 10 times more energy than other parts of the world. And China's rise is probably the clearest example. It is the first chunk of 1.4 billion people to develop. We are 1 billion people. Again, US, Europe, Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. There's 1.4 billion people in China. And I feel like it's being treated as a one-off. Well, they joined the WTO and their communist government sort of embraced capitalism for a little bit of a period. And somehow this doesn't count. China is at the middle income level. They are not rich yet. Now, they've got challenges, and we can debate China separately. But we still have India, 1.4 billion people. We've got the 54 countries of Africa, 1.4 billion people. We've got the entire rest of Southeast Asia, excluding China and India, which is about 1.4 billion people. And these buckets of 1.4 billion people, the 1.4 billion people club, as I call it, are using a fraction of the energy we do because their economies are a fraction of the wealth that we have. And it is an inextricable human march towards progress. Now, there may be wars. There may be bad governments. Venezuela's got an awful socialist government that has really ruined things for their people. So it's not that it's going to be a straight line up for any of these places, unfortunately. But it is, to me, we know how to do this. You use energy, you use capitalism, you do use democracy, and you have success. And that's uber simplified. There's probably some room for non-democratic places to actually have success. But the combination of energy and capitalism, I think, is undisputed in terms of making the world better off. And if you're going to do that, you're going to be using a heck of a lot more energy. So we darn well better spend a lot of money, trillions of dollars, maybe many trillions of dollars, trying to figure out whether it's commercializing nuclear, whether it's geothermal, wind, solar, all this other stuff, and stuff that probably we can't even imagine today, because I don't think you're going to want to be just dependent on oil and gas to meet what could be, if we're $100 million barrel a day oil market today, if everyone was similarly rich, 100 years from now, let's just pick a long time frame so we don't have to debate it. That's a 250 million barrel a day total addressable market. I do not think, and I do not forecast, that we will have 250 million barrels a day of oil demand in 21, 23. My point would simply be,
we might be
that's
demand,
the untapped
it's not
potential.
crude oil that we're getting out of the ground, right? It may not be the raw energy source.
I'll use that as sort of an equivalent energy need. And I think electric vehicles will be a big part of it. I think things we don't know is going to be a big part of it. I think nuclear is going to be a big part of it. And unfortunately, some people will perhaps stay poor. That's very unfortunate. It does not have to be. There will be wars along the way. There'll be disappointments, all that kind of stuff. So you can start eating away at it. The point would simply be that there is massive, massive energy needs for the rest of the world. And I think that's what we're trying to solve. And we do want to do it with as small of an environmental footprint as possible. But you got to provide people the energy they need first and foremost.
I love it. Well, that's where we have to leave it, unfortunately, because Arjun, I can tell you and I could chat for a long time. So
it's great to be here, Mark. I loved all your questions, and it's really good to spend time with you today. So
yeah, thanks so much. We appreciate it.